Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar titled Cyberspace Solarium Commission Report, an update for state regulators. I want to thank Protect Our Power for helping us host today's event. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Each of you will be in listen-only mode until the question and answer period. That question and answer period will take place after the panelists finish their presentations. And there will be instructions at that time for how to ask your questions. So with that, I would like to turn the floor to NARUC President Brandon Presley.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who's taken out time today to join us. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you this morning to the cybersecurity update from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which has authored a report that should be required reading for every one of us on this call. As the report's executive summary notes, we're dangerously insecure in cyberspace. Our entire lives, our paychecks, healthcare, electricity, and more all have in common a growing dependence on networks of digital devices that store, process, and analyze data. I think we all are seeing that clearly now during the pandemic. As we all know, a major cyber attack on the nation's critical infrastructure and economic system has the potential to wreak havoc on our society. Moreover, the current coronavirus pandemic has highlighted in stark terms the need for increased vigilance. Utility workers have been designated as essential in states across America and by our federal government. This work relies on a safe and reliable infrastructure, which requires cyber secure networks free of intrusion. Protecting the infrastructure is, of course, a top priority for NARUC. It has been for a long, long time. Our Critical Infrastructure Committee was created as a response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and nearly 20 years later, state regulators still need a forum to analyze solutions to utility infrastructure and delivery concerns. Fortunately, the committee, which tracks cybersecurity best practices for regulators, has exceptional and committed leadership from our chair, Gladys Brown Dutrail, Pennsylvania, and our co-chair, Jay Balablis of Washington State, UTC. I'm sure that they both join me in urging all of you on the webinar to undertake careful read of the Commission's report, which will be covered today in this webinar, and it includes more than 80 recommendations to face the challenges of cyber threats. Along with these recommendations is a set of 6 guiding principles. You'll hear the details shortly of the report and the principles. However, the first one is key, which states that deterrence is possible. Getting there is not going to be simple or an easy process, which is why the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and its report and collaboration across a broad spectrum of groups and stakeholders is imperative to achieve that possibility. Many thanks today go out to NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation for helping to facilitate this webinar and consistently contributing to the body of cyber literature. I can't say enough good things about CPI and the work that they do, the dedication of our CPI staff, and the arm that they are providing in strength of regulation from NARUC. I also want to thank Mr. Fanning with Southern Company and for his commitment and his encouragement during this time. We've been fortunate in Mississippi to work with Anthony Wilson and Sean Sheridan and your team here on these issues, and they're very much engaged, as I know not only Southern Company, but all of our investor-owned utilities and co-ops are around the country. This is a subject that is truthfully going to require collaboration between regulators and industry. We're in this boat together. We're all here to serve the public interest, protect the public interest, and we have to do that in the world of cyber threats. And so this is one of those sweet spots where industry and regulators can come together, collaborate, and find that intersection that meets all of our missions, and that is safe, reliable delivery of utility services free from a threat of cyber attacks. I also want to thank Kris Inglis, who is the former director of the NSA, the National Security Agency, and has ample insights. That we're fortunate to have him join us today, and we appreciate his time also. Finally, I want to thank my friend Richard Morose, former New Jersey commissioner, good friend of mine, great leader at NARUC, great leader in the industry and in this space. He's been an ardent champion of cybersecurity best practices and has helped facilitate this collaboration with Protect Our Power. Everyone on this webinar, all of us listening in or watching, are in a position to help resolve our cybersecurity challenges. We all can play a part in this, from wherever we sit and from wherever we come from on the spectrum. Take advantage of this opportunity, ask questions, be involved. I'm interested as NARUC president to hear your thoughts to continue our focus on cybersecurity. And I want to stress again the need for collaboration between regulators and industry and all stakeholders. We cannot do this in a silo. We cannot do this in a box. We've got to do this all together. So I appreciate you letting me join today. I appreciate again the work of CPI. Richard, thank you for what you've done. To Tom and Kris, thank y'all for joining us, and I will sign off. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brandon, appreciate both the introduction, your fine words, but also your leadership at NARUC. Thank you. And thanks to NARUC for this collaboration to discuss this very important work in the States around the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. I know many of you from my days as the chair of NARUC's Critical Infrastructure Committee and the good works that we've all done in advancing a more secure grid. These days, among other things, I'm helping Protect Our Power as an independent nonprofit advocacy organization on these issues. Protect Our Power advocates for an accelerated effort from all stakeholders to secure the grid, to protect our electric grid now. In our efforts, we've been fortunate to work with Tom Fanning and the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. We value his leadership, his advice, and encouragement to get impactful things done in this area. We're particularly grateful that he was appointed to the Solarium Commission and provided the important perspectives of the electric industry. We believe that cybersecurity, in many ways, a new battlefield, and the field itself of battle is the electric grid. These battles can also be played out and damage our electric systems as well as our water, gas, or telecom systems, impacting our financial services community, healthcare, and really our way of life. Now, during these challenging times with the pandemic, we see how important it is for a comprehensive approach to confronting cybersecurity. Protect Our Power is grateful for the ongoing dialogue we have with the Solarium Commission, with Tom Fanning, the co-chairs, Senator Angus King and Representative Mike Gallagher, and with the staff, particularly the Executive Director, Admiral Montgomery. We look forward to helping the Commission and staff convert their recommendations into law and regulations. And most importantly, we need everyone's input and support to move this transformative action plan to meaningful conclusions. That's why today we at Protect Our Power were pleased to work with NARUC to facilitate this discussion with Tom Fanning, also with his colleague, fellow Commissioner Kris Inglis, former Deputy Director of the NSA. So today we'll hear about the work of the Commission, its findings, a path forward to implement the measures to make the U.S. more secure, not just in the electric system, but all across industry. You know Tom Fanning as the CEO of the Southern Companies and having chaired the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. Now I'm pleased to introduce him as a Solarium Commission member. Tom, thanks for being with us, and we look forward to your comments and those of Kris Inglis.
Thanks, Rick. I really appreciate it. Rick Rose and the whole team at Protect Our Power has been just so valuable in helping us in this critical mission. And I just want to also throw my thanks out to President Presley and the whole NARUC family. This is such a critical issue, and I think President Presley said it's exactly right. This is an intersection of interest by everybody concerned, and I know you have this charge to help protect the infrastructure of the United States, without which we can't go forward with American commerce. And so we must bind together. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity, Rick, and thank you for making all this possible. You know, I've been helping lead the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council now. I'm in my 7th year. It's almost hard to believe. You know, I got to tell you, I think I got this role originally because I'm the only CEO in the industry that was formerly a CIO. Now, most of you know that stands for Chief Information Officer. I think most days I thought that stood for career is over. it is an exceedingly challenging area. And over the time that I've been leading this ESCC, it became very clear that it is not an effort that belongs in a silo. We know that we are interdependent, and it became very clear to me through work out of NIAC, the National Infrastructure Advisory Council to the President, that called out among the 16 segments of commerce, as denoted by Homeland Security, that 3 of them were denoted as lifeline sectors, without which we can't really run the American dream. And those are electricity, finance, and telecom. And so after a while, and we've really kind of blossomed here in the past year or two, we extended from working just on electricity to forming something called the Tri-Sector Group. So I work with Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, Brian Moynihan of BOA, and for the finance side. And on the telecom side, Randall Stevenson and his top lieutenant, John Donovan. So we have finance, telecom, and electricity with an intersection of interest. We've worked to build a joint threat matrix, to build what we call our wish list. That is, these are the kinds of things we need to build together. And so I've been very passionate about the notion of interdependence for these very critical parts of American commerce. And I got to tell you, I was thoroughly honored to be asked by Leader Mitch McConnell to join the Solarium Commission. Boy, you look around the table of my fellow commissioners, it's an embarrassment of riches. These guys are terrific. And, you know, when you sit in those meetings, and I guess, I don't know, Kris, about half of them were classified, you couldn't tell who was a Democrat and who was a Republican. I think we all dropped the mantle of our labels and really worked on developing this very important piece of kind of national doctrine. And I like to go back to Gallagher, is always great about talking about the history of Solarium. My own read on that is something like this, that the original Solarium Commission was put in place about 1959 or so, and it was following kind of World War II. No, 59, I guess, 53. Kris, when was it? Anyway.
1953.
It was
just after
53,
Stalin.
sorry. Yeah, following World War II, and the whole issue was this. Post-World War II, we had this emerging threat over there with the Soviet Union, and I think we really were challenged as a nation to rethink our military doctrine in that environment. Imagine this is the rise of NATO and all those events. And I think one of the big kind of scenarios they evaluated was essentially a giant tank battle on the plains of Poland, Soviet Union on one side, Western Europe on the other. You know, today, this Solarium Commission dealt with a threat that is not on the plains of Poland, but is on the networks of American companies today. I don't run around and say this publicly, but companies like mine get attacked millions of times a day. And so when you look at the whole threat of American commerce, it is enormous. And it's easy to think about kind of punk thugs and criminals, people trying to steal your Social Security number. But I think the threat that we face here is an existential threat that has the ability to interrupt our ability to communicate, our ability to transact business, our ability to have the power flowing in America. And so we've got to figure out a way to protect ourselves. And for so long, I think this threat has gone largely unanswered. And I think the Solarium Commission was put in place essentially to say enough, that there will be an approach to fight back against the bad guys. And I think the approach falls into 3 big buckets. One is to shape behavior, to make sure that for all of our allies and even our most important adversaries, say it's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, that there are accepted behaviors. There are standards of behavior that we all have to abide by. I think so far that has not really existed. It's been a little bit of the wild, wild west. The second is to, I think, impose costs. That is, if somebody crosses the line, what do we do to hold them accountable? You know, one of the efforts that I was very aware of as I led the ESCC under Homeland Security, it was the notion that a private company is largely charged with preparing for and responding to the threat. What was missing to me was in the middle, who's going to hold the bad guys accountable? Well, clearly now we have articulated a linkage, whether it's the DOD, U.S. Cyber Command, FBI, Secret Service, what have you. Now we know that we must have an integrated response. And so imposing costs on the adversary is critical because we want to make sure that if there is an action against us, there is an equal or better reaction against them. And then the final piece of the three big buckets of work here is to essentially deny benefits. And I think that's the area that I've been most focused on. I'm the only private company CEO on the commission. And so for the commission, I spoke to not only electricity, but essentially all of industry. Now, I did that by keeping a lot of my brothers and sisters in the telecom and finance area, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable up to speed. That was kind of a big challenge. Here's the point. We know that when you think about evaluating private industry, critical infrastructure, about 87% of the critical infrastructure in America is owned and operated by the private sector. Therefore, we can't be passive in this approach. We must collaborate. In fact, you will see as you read through the Solarium report, words like collaborate. Intentionally, we did not use words like cooperate. We must join together. This must be a joined effort to protect America's critical infrastructure. Now, Kris, I'll let you talk about maybe the 6 pillars, but let me finish with just some areas that I think are particularly important that I've really been hopefully a champion of, and I think the report comes out in a very constructive way. And then I'll finish with some comments to you, the regulators of the electricity sector. But first of all, it is the notion of critical infrastructure. And there is a lot of it in the United States. As we must collaborate in protecting that infrastructure, one of the findings of the commission was to evaluate which infrastructure in America is truly the most critical, most important. And I think we have a process in which to do that. So we've developed a concept that is taken under the label of systemically important critical infrastructure. We're evaluating the highest risk facilities in America, and we've identified, or we're identifying along the way, what the layers of critical infrastructure may be to preserve America. And those kind of criteria are what could disrupt our commerce in the most significant way, what could risk American lives, and what could impair our ability to fight back, our ability to listen, our ability to see. And so when you take those things together, you develop the most critical assets in America, and then we will evaluate the layers of infrastructure necessary to keep those facilities alive. And so we're working together to do that. The final concept I just want to bring up is this idea of a shared analytical environment. There is tremendous work going on at the federal government, with the intelligence agency, with our sector-specific agencies, with the Department of Defense and Cyber Command and FBI and others, and with the private sector. But it doesn't always happen together in a harmonized way. And so what we have done is proposed an idea, virtually and physically, to knit together the view of the battlefield and to work together for these, especially starting with these systemically important critical infrastructure areas, to have a joint responsibility, a joint view of the battlefield at machine speed. Don't think about some army of people in a nondescript office building in Beijing, China, pounding away on keyboards. Think about machines now attacking other machines. And so these millions of attacks per day that Southern Company experiences now becomes many-fold that. And in fact, we've got to really think about research and development in terms of how we're going to address these threats in the future, whether it's quantum computing or the advancement of artificial intelligence. Those are all parts of the report as well. But joining together with our federal partners, knitting together the state and local efforts, and pulling together private industry is going to be one of the most critical things we can do in the years ahead to protect America. My last comment, and then Kris, I'll flip it over to you, is this. We at Southern Company have always had a constructive relationship with our regulators, and broadly, you know, my chief counsel is Jim Carr. You know that he was a member of NARUC and came from the North Carolina Commission. And when we're able to see the kind of work that you all do, we have great respect for it, working with Rick Moroz and the kind of perspective that he can bring to bear through the Protect Our Power effort. We must work together. You know, our industry has been built on the concept of reliability. That is, as your system operates under normal conditions, what is the cost of an outage, and how should we build kind of a robust kind of profile to serve our customers? But it is clear, and maybe this underpinning of the virus that we're now facing, but certainly with cyber threats, the notion becomes not so much reliability, but resilience. Resilience, that is how your system operates under abnormal conditions. And so what do we do as an industry to provide resilient infrastructure to make sure that we can carry out our critical mission? We can't do that without the great work that you all provide. And I'm so thrilled to see over 180 people on the video today. I look forward to your questions. Kris, let me kick it over to you.
Thanks, Tom, and special thanks to President Presley, Rick, Gladys, and Jay for the kind of opportunity to have this and the work behind the scenes that makes this a very appropriate foundation for discussion of this strategy. I'm just going to build a little bit on Tom's remarks, and I think we'd like to go to questions and answers. First, kind of double down on what Tom said, which is a look over the shoulder would tell any of us that we're clearly not deterring bad activity in this space. That whatever we've been doing for the last 10, 15, 40 years since I've been a computer scientist has not led to a de-escalation of the threats in this space. You know, it's running a pace ahead of us. But the commission kind of concluded by consensus that while we have failed to deter actors of many stripes in this space, we can. And if I were to kind of characterize the strategy in a nutshell, it's essentially how do we apply all of the talents, all of the expertise, all of the authorities, such that an adversary in this space, in order to beat one of us, has to beat all of us. That's the bottom line. So Tom laid out a broad strategy that's described up front in the report. We call it the layered deterrence strategy, 3 components. How do you actually set expectations in that space, kind of shape behavior? How do you essentially kind of deny benefits, make it such that it's hard to kind of do bad things in this space, natural resilience, natural robustness? And how do you actually impose consequences on folks, individuals, nation states, and everybody in between who essentially transgress in the space? We support that strategy in this report with about 80 different actions. They're organized into what we describe as pillars, but for purposes of this discussion, they're simply clusters. We take those that are more alike than not, and we kind of organize those into chapters, and we say this cluster would support this particular line of effort. I'll roll through briefly what those 6 pillars are, with an emphasis perhaps on kind of what the key point is inside of each, and then hopefully we can go to some questions and answers. The first pillar is to reform government structure. Now, a classic organizational design person would say, you don't do the structure first, form should follow function. But everywhere we went, we had 300 separate engagements more. We heard that the government, the federal government in particular, was not well organized to be a viable, helpful partner to the private sector. And so we think that we need to first get the federal house in order. And so there's a broad array of actions inside that box. Or how do you assign roles, responsibilities? How do you get authority, capability, willpower aligned? How do you make it such that when the private sector does engage the government, particularly the federal government, that we're joined up and that we're ready to actually stand shoulder to shoulder and to help defend in that space, or as a predicate to the actual defense, how do we actually participate in the resilience and robust preparation? The second box of action, second pillar, is to strengthen norms and non-military instruments of power. Norms essentially are, how do you actually describe what is expected behavior in this space? How do you describe what is the inappropriate behavior in that space, such that if you're about to impose consequences for the transgressions in this space, you've actually signaled that up front. It's not a surprise, and you might, in fact, achieve some deterrence ability. The second part of that box, the strengthened non-military instruments of power, is that many citizens in the United States might be keenly aware that we've created something called the United States Cyber Command. That's a group of military individuals who have great expertise, and they can do interesting effects. They can do interesting operations in cyberspace. That's only one instrument that the government can bring to bear to create the sort of deterrence abilities that the government should create to create the right conditions for the private sector. We have legal instruments of power. We have financial instruments of power. The regulators on this call have those regulatory and perhaps kind of the imposition of compliance regimes as a basis of power. We have the bully pulpit. We can effect diplomacy. We can create coalitions. The government needs to be in a position to use all those instruments of power in a very proactive way, essentially identifying threats as early as possible, applying those instruments in a consolidated, coordinated fashion as early as possible to achieve the highest possible leverage to create the right conditions in this space. Third big box, as Tom indicated, is resilience is important. So we have a set of actions that say, how do we actually create national resilience? Such that when we experience anomalies or when things go boom in the night, we've got the muscle memory, we've got the systems, the protocols, we've got the coalitions that actually can work that through, that we're prepared in advance for those surprises. And while the surprise itself might not have been something we could predict, we can respond to that agilely and flexibly and effectively. The fourth big box is to reshape the cyber ecosystem. That's really about how do you kind of make it such that the system is naturally robust, naturally prepared, so that an adversary transgressor in the space actually has to pay a penalty simply to succeed in the first place. We're a harder target for them. And that's not just the technology, software, hardware, or the kind of ways that comes together, but that's the people piece as well. We need to train our people. Some of that's training, some of that's education, some of that's awareness, but every member of the cyber ecosystem, that's an individual, a company, or maybe a government, has a role to play, and they need to know what that is, and they need to be more and more digital natives, not just app natives. The fifth box is operational collaboration with the private sector. As a kind of shared parent of this report, I love all my children equally, but if I loved one more than the other, this is the one. To achieve operational collaboration between the private and the public sector, I think is a game changer. As Tom indicated, we're not talking about a division of effort. We're not talking about pushing information across some transom back and forth. We're talking about setting up relationships where we co-discover, co-mitigate threats in this space, because we might say to one another, the hole's not on my side of the boat, but increasingly it's the same boat. And we need to make sure that we're all kind of acting accordingly. And only in a collaborative relationship can you surprise each other with your insights, your hunches, your shards of information, such that kind of in the bowels of our stovepipes, putting those together, we can actually come to conclusions you can't, with any amount of individual effort. And then finally, the last of the 6 boxes, the last pillar, is we affirm the military instrument of power. We affirm what Cyber Command's been doing, essentially something described as forward defense, meaning that we will, as a matter of defense, not wait on shore for an adversary, particularly a nation state, to come at us. We won't run around willy-nilly and catch the arrows. We'll go for the bow. right? We will move forward and at the earliest possible moment with great kind of precision, granularity, take care of the problem at the earliest possible moment so that we don't leave it to all God's creatures to run across the kind of open territory and figure out how to deal with this once that cat's out of the box. That's appropriately the sixth box, the sixth pillar of the strategy, because we're not leading with military power. We want to lead with coalition power. We want to lead with every one of us, every kind of expertise, every authority that we have across the private and public sector needs to be brought to bear concurrently with a sense that, again, bottom line, you need to beat all of us to beat one of us. That's a quick walkthrough of what the report actually has in it. Again, 80 discrete actions for those of you that are inclined to want to read something interesting, pithy, light on its feet. It's available at www.solarium.gov. No one will ask you for a political contribution if you go there. And there are two forms of the report, one 16 pages long, and one is probably upwards of 180 pages long, lots of footnotes for those of you into the details. I'll go back over to Tom for any kind of wrap-up remarks, and then we'll look forward to your questions.
Yeah, no, and please ask away. Both Kris and I love the debate and really enjoy the insights that you have to offer to solving this important problem. And it is a tough problem. So much of what goes on is unseen. I remember I was on Maria Bartiromo's show, and I was telling her that kind of fighting the cyber threat of America is a bit like she and I walking out on a beach and watching a submarine battle. You know, all you can see is kind of the normal action of the waves in the ocean. We know that underneath the waves and out of sight is ongoing and lethal activity. And very often, the only time we ever see something is when the cataclysmic event happens. So this is a little bit of a tough one, but I think it's important to understand the threat, to lay out some very useful parameters on how to combat it and work together to make America better. So that's what we're after here. Rick, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for being with us today, but thank you both for your work on the commission and your deliberations and just your leadership on these matters. Let me just review a few things here that what we'll do for the next few minutes in the question and answer session. We have the instructions, as you see. You can use the function to raise your hand. I think most everyone on this platform has used it before. Lynn Constantini will announce your name, and then we'd ask you to identify yourself and to either Tom or Kris who you're posing the question and then your question. But I have just a couple of quick follow-up questions for you. And thank you, Kris, for reminding everyone where they can find the report, and we'd encourage everyone to do that at solarium.gov. You both talked about resilience. We've all been around this industry, regulators, the industry representatives, talking about resilience and how we get there, what it is, how we measure it. But first and foremost, no doubt, I think there's agreement amongst everyone, it will require additional investment. And in the utility sector, a 100-year history of prudency regulation, resilience goes above and beyond, as you mentioned, Tom, from a standard benchmark of reliability. Just if you could give any thoughts on how our audience, because they are regulators, should be looking at those issues to be thinking about the needed investments that are going to have to come to make our systems and our country more resilient.
Yeah, every company is going to be a little bit different, and what you have to do is right size your experience and your infrastructure compared to what's required. In fact, my co-chairs on the ESCC, Kevin Wales, runs the utility out of Lincoln, Nebraska. Dwayne Hiley is out west. And so they have very different requirements than somebody like Southern Company. We're building a nuclear plant. We've already engaged in a significant way NSA and FBI in helping to protect that investment. But here's the deal. I think when you get a sense of priority, We already have, in the utility industry, thankfully, under the leadership of NARUC, reliability standards, and I think increasingly the notion of resilience standards. And we already have a sense of what are the most primary infrastructures we have. What we have to do is to work with you all to understand how best to protect that, physically and in a cyber sense. So there's a lot here. One of the things that, and I can't speak for all of my brothers and sisters in the industry, but I will say this. I would love for the jurisdictions that we serve, I would be glad to invite you commissioners into say a one-day read-in, perhaps at the secret level, so that you could actually see the kinds of threats we're facing and the kinds of actions we're taking. But I want to caution everybody, there is no one-size-fits-all. There's not a silver bullet that gives us the answer. Another funny kind of metaphor I use is this cyber threat is a little bit like the old 60s lava lamps. It continually moves and morphs and changes. And as we close off a threat, a new threat emerges. The attack surface changes, the defense surface, therefore, must change. So my point is this. We need to do more. I'm already working with on a pilot now with the Tri-Sector group, joining what was formerly called the FSARC, thinking about a strategic evaluation of the joint threats between the financial sector and the utility sector. That's going to cause a little bit of expense. We've all agreed that it's the right thing to do, and we'll probably come to you guys for recovery of those expenses. But boy, there's a lot more that goes on as we think down the road. Also, I just want to say so many companies have gotten out of the research and development business. I really do think that private industry needs to collaborate again with government to think about the research and development kind of innovation initiatives that must occur. These are big things that can be largely funded by government, but I think critical infrastructure has an obligation to share with the government the development of the kinds of things we need in the future to make America safer. Kris, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so supporting all of that, I would just say it's probably appropriate that the godfather of this Solarium project was, in fact, Dwight D. Eisenhower, because one of my favorite quotes from him was, the plan is nothing, planning is everything. Now, having said that, plans do matter, right? The scripts and the compliance and the regulate, they matter. But his point is that you can't actually come up with a script that's going to be perfect for every event that you can't predict. And so, I think as regulators, you should be as interested in the muscle memory and the planning activities for the anomalies and the uncertain events as you are in the scripts and the preparation for those things that we can reasonably suspect would happen. In this regard, cyberspace is famous for teeing up kind of low probability events that have high consequence and kind of shock, stunning, and amazing, right? Its audience. And muscle memory is probably the best defense against that. Who knew 2 months ago that in this COVID-19 crisis, we were going to move dramatically to infrastructure, the last tactical mile of which is in my house or your house and other places in between. So if we make security a commodity, if we essentially have muscle memory, prepare the front lines of this cyber skirmish, which is in fact the people, we're going to be in a better situation to be resilient in the future.
Thank you.
Hey, and Kris, I'll just add to that in this COVID-19 response, I got named. I'm the only guy out of the industry that got named to the president's team on how to re-engage the economy. The electricity sector is a little bit different. So is the gas sector. We can't take a day off. We can't just close down our dry cleaners or our restaurant or whatever it is. And so the issue is, how do we create a coronavirus regime, a protocol that we can live and work with this threat? By the same token, we must develop a protocol where we can live and work with the cyber threat. And it is real, and it is ongoing, and it is potentially lethal.
Thank you. One other question, and Kris, you touched on it particularly about the organizational aspects of the recommendations, reorganization, streamlining, and particularly around efforts such as the information sharing activities you mentioned. Are the systems, the processes, the structures in place to be able to share effectively information from the federal government to the state governments? Is that structure in place, or do we need to really start from a new baseline for that kind of activity? Or can we take what's already in place, streamline it, and have more effective information sharing, particularly between federal and state agencies?
Yeah, I would say it's not what it needs to be. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
It's not what it needs to be, but I think the handholds are in place that we can achieve some initial traction. So let me just roll through a couple of things that need to be changed or perhaps moved forward. First, the federal government needs to see the states, the local governments, and to the extent that the private sector, as Tom says, is acknowledged as owning, operating, innovating 80% of that space. They need to see them as a formal customer for federal services. You mentioned intelligence. We need to kind of make sure that the intelligence community doesn't see that as an opportunity to share information that's derived for some primary purpose, but a primary purpose, right? And so take requirements from the kind of state or the private sector, kind of chase using the kind of extraordinary methods that the federal government has, chase that information and ultimately provide that back, whether that's threat information, best practices, but make a meaningful contribution to the intellectual property of the group that essentially is on the front lines of the cyber skirmish, the cyber war. Second, I think that the federal government's not well joined up in terms of who deals with whom, who has what responsibilities. I earlier said that an observation made to the commission on many occasions was that capability, will, authority within the federal government's not always in the same place. We often heard kind of an organization in the private sector say, I want a relationship with, I'll just use a hypothetical, I want a relationship with NSA, but I'm supposed to go see someone else. How do I actually kind of get what I need as opposed to go where you've told me to go? The government needs to make sure that if we just declare that the Department of Homeland Security is the front door, or a sector-specific agency is the front door for some specific function, that they actually either have the capability or they've got the relationship with the rest of the federal government such that that entity, state government, maybe it's a kind of a private sector entity, they don't need to figure out how to run pillar to post to get that teed up. So there's a broad array of activities the government needs to undertake, and we do that in Pillar 1 to essentially be joined up, coherent, put capability, will, and authority, if not in the same place, at least through the same lens, and make it such that if you're a state government, if you're a local government, if you're a private sector entity, and you have a legitimate need from the federal government, and we think increasingly you will, right, that you have a high expectation that you're going to get that on the first pass. You don't actually have to figure out how to put that together yourself. And too often today, you do.
Yeah, and I'll just add here too that, Rick, when you ask the question, this idea of sharing becomes kind of a paramount issue in Congress and everything else. I think where we want to go here is to almost obviate the notion of sharing. This must be a joint enterprise, and therefore we would know the same thing at the same time in the same way for the most critical of our infrastructure. So that's kind of thing one. The other kind of thing is, you know, at the state and local level, I think every state does a pretty good job of that. And in fact, way back when Homeland Security was formed, we created at every state and certainly in other major cities these fusion centers. Okay, I know there are efforts to knit those together, but I think those are incomplete, and I think we need to do a much better job of that. The other thing that's going on is the National Governors Association has lots of work to try and think about how to do this cybersecurity job at a state level. My whole point here, and a word I've used a lot, is to harmonize. So much at the federal government, great work, true patriots in this intelligence community effort, but knitting that together, as Kris suggests, knitting together what's going on at the state, and then collaborating with private industry is the big charge. Last one I'll just add is it's not just a domestic issue, it's an international issue. The last war game that this industry played involved Canada. And in fact, on the ESCC, we have Francis Bradley, who represents the electricity sector in Canada in all of our deliberations. So it's a pretty complex issue, but it's something that we have to harmonize and bring together.
Great.
Rick, if I could just add one more point, I was an active duty Air Force officer for a while, but I spent most of my military career in the Guard. So my fellow Guardsmen would say I have been remiss in not calling out that as a principal place where state and federal fusion naturally takes place. And we call that out. We talk about using those resources to a greater effect. Classically, in the legalese of this, we talk about taking Title 32 authorities, which are invested in governors, and melding those and achieving a collaboration with Title 10 or Title 50 authorities, which classically are the federal governments. That occurs naturally already within the Guard elements. There are many states that already have Guard units that are focused on cyber. We think we need to make better use of that. That's illustrative, not exhaustive in terms of how the report deals with this, but we've looked for all those opportunities to make progress.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your responses. We're now in this segment also joined by Admiral Mark Montgomery, the Executive Director of the Commission. Mark is joining you as well in case there are questions about the works of the Commission or the recommendations that you need the Executive Director's additional commentary. So Mark, thank you for joining us as well. Lynn will now open this up to questions from all the participants.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. We are now in the Q&A from the audience segment of our presentation today. To do so, to ask a question of our panelists, you can use the raise hand feature. You will see that on the GoToWebinar dashboard on your right-hand side. I will then unmute you, and please, when it's your turn, announce your name and the commission that you're with, and the panelist to whom you would like to direct your question. Let me also say that if we do run out of time, we have a lot of folks on the call, and I'm sure so many of you would like to ask questions, but in the event we do run out of time, you can email your questions to me. I am Lynn Costantini. I am the Deputy Director of CPI at NARUC. You can find my contact information on the NARUC website. So with that, I will open the floor to questions. Please raise your hand.
While we're waiting, it seems like we maybe have answered everyone's questions. But Lynn, stop me if you see people raising their hands.
Sure.
To state commissions, as both regulators and policymakers, what kind of specific roles or actions do you think they can take to help advance the recommendations of the Commission? Tom, you're on mute.
Okay, gotcha. Well, I'm not now. Yeah, clearly taking the report and asking their companies what they think of it. One of the, I don't know, Kris, was it controversial, but we had lots of good debate, and there was lots of good debate throughout this whole commission. But was this idea of holding industry accountable for the right kind of standards of cyber hygiene, et cetera. And I think where the commission came out was to use a vehicle like Sarbanes-Oxley. And remember when that got passed, it created a new obligation on the part of audit firms to assess your control environment. One of the issues that we would propose is to extend the notion of your control environment to having appropriate cyber hygiene for the kind of business that you have. I think that's critically important because from a commission standpoint, that is a standard that is flexible yet firm, and it puts people like me, CFOs, CEOs, on the hook because we have to sign financial statements that represent that our control environment is appropriate for the kind of business we run. And the other thing that I think it links in is the idea of board accountability. The boards also must approve the filings that companies make. If we include our responsibility, our accountability, not an option, to run our businesses in a certain way, to provide the kind of resilience in this manner, then I think this is a very positive development. And it is, we have an accountability to the commissions to make sure that happens. So I think, look, I think there's lots of different ways we can do it, but I think the first thing we'll start with an interrogatory between the commission and the company. What do you think? I'm glad to say that, in fact, I handed this out to the Solarium Commission. We already had in our industry a self-report on our own cyber hygiene. It dealt with, not just penetration testing, but something like 60 different items of evidence that would say, yeah, in fact, I operate my system well or not, or what your level of maturity was. You can go to those kinds of things and start a discussion.
Great, thanks. Lynn, do we have any questions from the participants?
Yes, we do. The first one is from Commissioner Chivukula.
Upendra?
Commissioner, you'll have there you go. You can ask your question, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great presentation. Hi, Rick. And one of the questions I have is that I have not clearly gone through the report. I'm planning to do that. My question is the grid, as we see, is transforming. There's more and more distributed generation, and you have consumers are becoming also producing, so they're becoming prosumers. And then number of IoTs are increasing by billions. And for cybersecurity, for cyberspace, there are multiple entries into the network. How do you account for that, and how well your report is adapting, how quickly your report can adapt to the changes that nobody has thought about so far? Thank you for that.
Quick answer is that we've always contemplated a variety of threats, and as I mentioned to you, they always change. When you look at the threat that was the attack that was taken out against the Ukraine, that wasn't just somebody pinging a server for denial of service. Rather, it was somebody taking over the operational features of the electricity organization there. Listen, and as I mentioned, this threat changes all the time. And so we really do have to think about not only kind of the technical cyber, but the operational standards that we have to adhere to. I can tell you that, and I think, Kris, you were big on this in the evaluation of small and large businesses, the advisability of using the cloud and all that it gives to small business. I met with the head of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. I met with the head of Amazon Web Services. We really do need to deepen the integration among the cloud providers, the federal government, the infrastructure providers as well.
Yes, I would just add to that that there is a role for kind of hard and crisp standards, right? I'm not an electrical engineer, but I'm kind of keenly aware that there's certain things that should happen on these lines and certain things that shouldn't, and there's no kind of equivocation or gray space in between. But in the matter of cyber security, right, there's a lot of gray space, and we can't actually perfectly prescribe what those standards, protocols, and compliance regimes are at a distance. So increasingly, you need to be in a dialogue with the local operators who might have unique circumstances. Maybe a high degree of, one locale is kind of self-generated house by house solar panels, and in another one, it's almost entirely provided by the Tennessee Valley Authority. You need to allow for those differences to occur and have that dialogue that is increasingly more continuous, less episodic, such that resilience, robustness, and the delivery of kind of reliability is an ongoing partnership between the regulators and the providers. I think that we'll be in a better place then because we'll actually be collaborating without actually putting the fox in the hen house.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Shivakula from New Jersey. Lynn, other questions?
Yes, the next question comes from Hisham from NARUC. Hisham, the floor is yours. Please state your full name and your question.
Thank you. This question is first, this is Hisham Shwaiki from NARUC. I'm the Principal Technical Advisor, used to be an Ohio regulator. My question is, Tom, I heard you talk about the cooperation with finance, with the finance industry and with the telecom industry. How about the natural gas industry, given that a large number of combined cycle units now are connected to large pipelines? And when I was in Ohio, we used to talk about PJM building their resilience and operational awareness of power plants that are connected, for example, on one pipeline, and making sure, for example, when they're developing contingencies, they make sure that they don't rely on all of these units all at once. So to the extent, go ahead.
Yeah. Look, I was probably remiss in not kind of explaining that. We took the approach some time ago in the ESCC to look at upstream and downstream kind of applications, and so certainly now, as a regular part of the ESCC meetings, we have representation from the distributors, AGA, INGA, the pipelines, et cetera. So we are now attempting to integrate vertically, if you will, from the delivery of energy broadly, including electricity and the supply chain issues we have with the pipes. Look, it is absolutely clear that America has moved away from coal. And while there's a lot of penetration of renewables, the intermittency aspects of renewables require load following generation in the form of natural gas. And it's cheap and it's plentiful. So it's an important part of the American commercial picture. We've got to integrate them. And I think we're doing that within the ESCC now. They're a part of our deliberations every day.
Thank you. Lynn, we probably have time for one more question from the participants. Are there any others?
There are not. I'll give everybody just an opportunity one more time to raise their hands and ask a question.
Well, then maybe with the remaining time, let me ask you both this, and knowing the audience, what are the one or two or three things that you think that, and I should say also, we didn't have time to review them. I know that the commission will be putting forward a series of proposals that track the recommendations for legislation and other implementation efforts. But what are the two or three things that state commissions you think commissioners can be doing to help support the efforts generally of the commission and your recommendations?
Yeah, I would say read the report and ask your utilities what they think of it. Ask them to respond to it. You know, it's funny, the old joke is, what's a CEO interested in? It's what his board is interested in. And what's my management team interested in? It's what I'm interested in. I guarantee you the utility will take notice if you show interest in how the companies view the report and what they intend to do about it. This will call for different kinds of action by different kinds of entities. And I think your engagement in our plans and how to respond to the future threats is a big deal. And when I say future threats, don't get excited about the here and now and the rearview mirror. This is all about the headlights of your corporation, skating to where the puck will be. As I said, this threat is ongoing. It is continuous and lethal. And we've got to get ourselves ready today for the threats that will occur 2 to 3 to 5 years from now. So show interest and ask them to respond. I think that's the easiest way to start a dialogue. And certainly from our industry, we have already, I think, a lot to offer in terms of making sure that our infrastructure is protected as well as it can be.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Kris, any
I
other?
just build on that. I think it was Ronald Reagan once said that the most dangerous or kind of terrifying 10 words spoken are "I am from government and I'm here to help." So that often is the kind of feeling when a regulator shows up. I've kind of had regulation in my life before, and I generally have always thrived and prospered when I embraced that, when the regulator that I was dealing with, whether that's an inspector general or a literal regulator, I'm on a bank board at the moment, when they kind of consider that perhaps what we do before the event is more important than what happens during or after an event. And as regulators, you can set the tone for that and declare that you want to have that sort of continuous relationship, understand a little bit more about the thinking, the modalities, the preparation, the muscle memory of the regulated, those parties that are regulated, such that we can get closer to a collaboration that doesn't in any way, shape, or form push off accountability. That's still important. But we're going to have to actually get to a place where we're more agile, we have more muscle memory, we're prepared for the unimaginable, simply because we've kind of filled in all of the gray space, which there's a lot of gray space out there at the moment. I just thank everybody on this line for what you do. I'm both a commissioner and a consumer of the good work that takes place because of what you do broadly, nationally, across the country. I never have to worry about whether something's going to happen when I flip that switch in my house. And so thank you for that.
Right. Well, we've reached the end of the hour, and I want to thank you both for your participation, your service. We look forward to seeing the additional recommendations and suggestions of the commission and to following them. Everyone can find more both on the recommendations and updates on the website for the commission at www.solarium.gov. More about our work and these issues at Protect Our Power's website, www.protectourpower.org. And of course, NARUC is very involved, will continue to be pushing out information and to be educating on these issues. And NARUC will be providing updates as well. I want to thank again everyone at NARUC to help put this together today. The leadership at NARUC, including Greg White and its president, Brandon Presley. Thank you, and thanks to all the participants today for joining and for taking interest in this very important set of issues. Thanks again to everyone. We appreciate you being on today, and be safe. Thanks now.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, all.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, Rick. Great seeing you, buddy.
Likewise, we'll be in touch. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn.